So knowing the community, it's really important to know the community. So you need to look at the data. And we actually have, there's going to be a list up that tells you where all those resources are. So the kind of data I'm talking about is, you can start with the farm census. You want your local census data. If you're thinking about a grocery store, you're going to need to know something about the income levels of the people that live in the, where you're at. What are they going to depend on? You can do a search for studies and white papers. I'm always amazed when I go out there and start searching how many studies are written or papers are written about communities, especially rural communities, by students in some place like LA. You know, but sometimes there's something actually valuable there because they see things we don't see. They're not close to it. But it always amazes me what's out there. The other thing about the economic picture and getting to know about food security, there's something called Map the Meal Gap, which is done by Feeding America. And it tells you by parish, you can get it down to the parish data, or by congressional district. It tells you how many people are below 130% of poverty, how many, and are food insecure, how many people between 130% and 185% or 200% of poverty are food secure, how many people who don't qualify for federal food programs but are food insecure.
What is the name of it?
It's called Map the Meal Gap. It also tells you what the average price per person per meal is in that community. So you have a state number and you'll have a, yes please, you'll have a state number and you'll have a number for your parish.
You can even narrow it.
Right. And then it separates out data for childhood food insecurity too. So there's both in general food insecurity and then there's child food insecurity. So percentage of children who are living in food insecure households.
Hey, Sharon, I printed out the community resource or resources page that we're using for tomorrow and for Saturday for everybody here.
Okay, great. So you got that.
Yeah.
One of the key things is figuring out how people communicate. How do they get information? Especially in rural communities. I went into working in Applegate Valley, which is a coastal, like it's a valley out in the Coast Range of Oregon. People go there who don't live there just to drink wine and sit on the porch of the resort or to fish. That's why they go there. But it's always how they're, you know, I mean, it's 35 miles to the nearest town of any size. And so how do people communicate? Because certainly the TV station doesn't communicate with them. And we have a lot of places in Oregon. We have television stations on the west side, and we have television stations out of Boise that serve the east side. And of course, they don't communicate about Oregon. So how do people communicate? So we found out that listservs, there's a lot of community listservs. I don't know, you know, do they get all their information from the person at the corner store? Is it the pastor? Is it word of mouth? Is it the pastor? How does the information get around? And I've always been interested in, it's interesting to me as I start asking this question, who is it that tells everybody what's going on? Is it the school? Does the school send out a newsletter? We discovered one community that the school secretary wrote a newsletter every week to tell everybody what was going on. Little tiny mountain community. That was how everybody knew what was happening. And everybody went by to get the newsletter from the church secretary that didn't have kids in school, because that was the way they found out what was going on. Right. And of course with the internet now, there are more people that get their information somehow or another. Is it a Facebook page? Is it whatever it is? And we've also found rural grocery stores that are being really successful using Facebook and Twitter because they don't have any means of mass communication. They aren't tied into an advertising network, but they can use something like that to advertise flash sales to let people know what's going on. Oh, we got a deal on such and such. We brought it in. Come by and get some. We're thinking about making a bulk order What would you like to have? That kind of thing. It's good to develop a food system picture. And that could be you make an inventory. You know, you write a list and say, this is what I'm working from. You draw a picture of it. But get a good idea for yourself of what the food system looks like. You know, from the local to you know, where's the global food system? How does the global food system fit in? Where's the food going that's produced by that? Because 9 times out of 10, the people working in that global food system, especially at the lowest worker level, are also the people that are food insecure. So that's a good idea. You need to determine the role of your faith community. Every community is different. I happen to live in Oregon, which is one of the most unchurched states in the nation. So sometimes it's not very strong. But it all depends. And one of the things we found is a lot of people in Oregon won't go to a church for an event. So we don't use churches very often, unless I'm really doing a church-based event. And we still have granges. It's like, I don't even know how to explain what a grange is. It's a rural, they've been around since the late 1800s. And it's an organization that's devoted to supporting rural family life. So it's not a fraternal organization, but it's very similar to the Elks and the Moose, but it included the entire family. So granges are one of the places that we frequent. Gatekeepers. I can't say enough about gatekeepers. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say gatekeepers?
Those who control.
Yeah, those who control. And in rural communities, it's extremely important. When I first came out to Oregon and I was working in volunteer management, and I took a training from somebody who lived up in Alaska, and she started talking about gatekeepers, and I'm going, what are you talking about? So she went on to explain, and she said, and the gatekeeper in our community is the bartender. And that was also how everybody communicated. If you wanted to know anything, you went and told the bartender at the local tavern, and everybody, it was the only place to eat, and everybody went through there. And if you wanted somebody to come volunteer at an event, you went and told him, and he told them to show up. And that's how you got things done. I have seen that repeat itself, not with the tavern so much, but there are a few places in Oregon that I would tell you the tavern is the place. But who is in charge? And when we were working in Hawaii last year in one particular community, if we didn't have Uncle Roy's approval, they actually had me come and do a week over there so I could meet, so all the gatekeepers in these different places could meet me and build a relationship with me so that people would come the next month to our events with Native Hawaiians and other groups, Samoans. So you just can't begin to, and some places it's organizations, like is the Rotary the go-to place in this community where everybody in the business community goes, and if you go and talk to the Rotary, then that will happen. Whatever you need it is to have happen will happen. Or do you need to get, I work in one community in Southern Oregon where there's a sort of a not formal, an informal ranchers group that meets every so often, and they meet at the Eagles Lodge on Saturday nights usually. And you want to go hang out with them at the Eagles Lodge on Saturday night if you want something to happen. You know, and if you want to have a meeting, you have it there. You ask them for their space, and then they'll come. So another thing that's really important if you're trying to start something new is to look around and figure out what has this community been successful at? What works really well? Is there a school event that works really well? Who's involved? How do they get it done? Look at those successes, figure out who's involved and why are they successful. Ask around. and figure out why it is that that particular event is successful. Is it a person that's involved? Is it a certain issue that appeals to people? What is it that's going on that makes that successful? And that can tell you a lot about what you need to do to make things work. And that's true of churches too. I mean, I see that in churches too. If you,
Because you say that you all know about that much, a church community in Oregon, in places you've been, how hard is it to cross denominational lines? Because I know sometimes that's a hard ball game.
So, my experience is it's not hard to cross denominational lines. It's more about the separation between the evangelicals and the more liberal churches. That's the more conservative versus more liberal. That's the hard place to get the crossover. And we actually have communities in Oregon where pretty small communities where they'll have the ministerial association, but there's one group that's the more conservative churches, and then the more liberal, the United Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Lutherans will be over here, and the ELCA, the Missouri Synod Lutherans, and the rest of the evangelicals will be in a different group. It's sometimes really hard to get those two groups to work together. And is there an organization called Love Inc. here? Are those organizations?
Yeah, there is an organization with all of the religious groups in town. I can't remember what it's called. But there it is.
Yeah, I don't know.
And I can't think of what it is. The rabbi and...
That's a good thing to know.
The ministerial
Is that
Or
what it is?
ecumenical ministries. Sometimes they're called ecumenical ministries.
That's
Sometimes they're a ministerial alliance.
That'd be a good group to infiltrate.
It would.
And Jane said to me today at the food bank when we were talking about, because about 70% of our agencies in Oregon, our food pantries, are in church-based settings. And then another 20% or so are in what I would call faith-affiliated settings. And Jane said to me today, I asked her about that specifically here, and she said the most successful agencies are the ones where a number of churches have come together to do things. So that way it's a strength in numbers kind of thing. The one thing that I see happen in food pantries in churches where there's one person that's their passion and the church says, oh, go do it kind of thing, then you don't have a succession plan, it's not strong, it's not fully supported. That's always a challenge. And often that person, as they get older, don't want to give things up. So some key things I want you to remember. It's always important to highlight a community's resources, assets, as well as its needs. People are always going to want to talk about the deficits or the needs, but if you can get them to talk about assets and about what's going right, and you can frame it in terms of opportunity and instead of what's wrong, you're going to get a lot further down the road. So we always try to do that. The other thing I said earlier, any kind of an assessment is an organizing tool. Even if you're doing an inventory, it's important to not just do the inventory, but explain to people what you're doing and talk to them and make them feel like they're part of it. And then when you're done whatever it is you're doing, you go back and report to them. Loop back in and re-include them. Community foods organizing always has to include the grassroots of a community. If you just are talking to the policymakers and the grass tops kind of folks, the business people, then you don't have what you need, and you're not going to have motivation. I mean, if you want to get a community-owned grocery store going and successful, everybody's got to feel like they own it. Everybody who's going to shop there has got to feel like they own it, and they're part of it. And this kind of organizing is done with communities, not to them. That's been a huge piece of what we've talked about with people, is we don't come from the outside or even as a small community or leadership team and decide what a community wants. A lot of times we'll go into a community and there'll be an organizing group, and they've made up their mind about what they want to do before they've talked to anybody. And it'll be, and a lot of times I'll know pretty well after doing this for quite a few years, that's not going to fly. Especially if it's somebody that's new to the community, or it's one of those community controllers. So it's really important that people do the work with the community, not make decisions for them and tell them what they're going to do.
Because I know we did a witnesses in the community, and it's several people that, you know, sell snacks in the apartment complex. So we had free hot dogs and free sodas and free chips that day. But I went to everybody and just told them what we was doing, because I didn't want to affect their income. And I just said, we're going to be giving away free food. And I brought them free food. But I know for those 4 hours, you know, they wasn't going to get any traffic from the children. But I spoke with them, you know, let them know what we was doing.
So is it like food cart kind of thing where they sell, or a grocery store where they sell?
Candy and sodas, you know, out of the
Yeah.
apartment. It's about
Oh,
like
out of
4
their
people.
apartment?
It's like 4 people that does it. But
Yeah.
I know we was giving away, like
Oh,
the
you're talking
sodas.
about like, yeah, okay, so that's, like, an older person will like buy candy at Sam's and they'll sell it to kids it's a thing, yeah. It's a real
Okay,
thing.
that's a thing I've never heard of,
Yeah,
but okay.
and like, and what are the ice cups or the,
Ice stuff.
yeah, they'll make ice cups, it's just a grandma thing.
Snow cones?
Yeah, but I mean like, and it's just it's whoever decides to make a little extra cash on the side.
It's almost like a gypsy market kind of.
Yeah, it is, very.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's just a southern thing or.
But the jewelers, I know the jewelers is a southern thing. You know, I grew up where, you know, most of the stores, you know, you always had this old lady that sold, you know, cookies and.
Yeah, but see, it's not just Rapides Parish, because I'm from Cattahoula, and there was
Same,
places
yeah,
that, yeah, things that happened even in the very rural. Somebody's grandma always had something, you had 25 cents, you could get a candy bar.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. All right, learn something new. I told John I learn as much as I share with people. So I just want to talk about facilitation, because you're always going to be facilitating meetings, and how you facilitate has a huge effect on the success of what you're doing. So as a facilitator, you want to, and community food systems, because you're there with an agenda, but you want to make sure that you're not imposing your agenda on people. So guiding a group through the agenda is important, and having an agenda is important. Not just, we're going to hold a meeting, everybody show up. You need to have an agenda. Focusing energy of the group on the task at hand, so don't let people go 6 directions. Remaining neutral in regard to the content of the discussion and the organizing plan. So don't start judging what people are saying as they go through. I mean, if you're brainstorming, whatever it is you're doing, don't start making judgments or saying you can't do that, because even if if it failed before, it doesn't mean it's going to fail this time. Any kind of an activity where you're having people work in a group, or you want them to put tomorrow, well, Saturday we're going to do a snow card exercise where we end up with stickies all over the wall. And then we sort them out. You need to give really clear directions, whatever method it is that you're using. You need to encourage people to participate fully, especially if they're in a breakout session. Sometimes people are just not going to speak up, and you have to ask them. You know, it's like the people who say, I've never donated because nobody ever personally asked me to donate. And then they write you a $1,000 check. It's like nobody asked. So try to keep the group's energy positive and focused on the task at hand. We have just gone through the last few years of an anti-GMO campaign in Oregon. That was on the ballot. And it was interesting to try to keep these groups focused and not because I would get one person in the room who was passionate about the anti-GMO stuff, and they wanted the whole thing to turn into that, and that was not our purpose. We didn't have a stand. We don't have a stand one way or another. We're the food bank, and what we would say is, if when we do the breakouts and we decide on what we're going to talk about, if that's one of them, that's fine. That's the community's decision. I never had a GMO group come out of it. Never did. Never impose your agenda and interest on the group. And if you have to come with a particular focus or interest to a group, then tell them that up front. Put that in your original agenda. This is what I need to do. I used to work with, Oregon has a unique model of low-income gleaning groups that have been around for now 40 plus years. So it's low.
Can you explain what gleaning is too? After you're, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but
sure.
Some people.
So gleaning is just like from the Bible, harvesting from the fields after the harvest, or if.
I was assuming that's what you
right.
meant.
Yeah. But in Oregon, during the Johnson administration's war on poverty, when Community Action was formed, there was a really strong community food systems programming that was formed. So our first farmers markets, some of our first food co-ops came out of that, first community gardens, and these gleaning groups. And the gleaning groups consisted of low-income people organized together to go out and harvest from the fields. And they became their own 501c3 nonprofit organizations. And how I got started in this work was working with a firewood gleaning program, because a lot of people we heat with wood, and there's a lot of excess firewood in Oregon, waste wood. And so I started with that, and then became a staff person. I was a Vista volunteer and became a staff person running the food gleaning programs for a two-county area in the Willamette Valley. Now that program has over 8,000 low-income people involved.
So is there like do they have to meet certain criteria to belong to the group, or?
Be under 200% of poverty income, but it's a self-declaration.
Right.
Yeah, and it could be that you have excessive medical costs or housing costs. We have really high housing costs in Oregon, so that bring you into under that income level.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, so we have thousands of people involved in harvesting and sharing their own food, and all of those people, and they also now glean from the food industry. Like, we'll get bulk totes of frozen product that they repack and redistribute. But they have adoptees, which are seniors and disabled folks who aren't able to go out and harvest. So able-bodied family folks, able-bodied folks participate in these programs, and then they share that food. It's a pretty unique program. And a lot of times they have a leadership council that comes together of all the coordinators of these groups. And a lot of times I would have a need in terms of my gleaners, like, okay, they've asked me for a new report. How do you guys want to implement us gathering these numbers and so on, because it affects you too. I'm going to need it to go in my report, but how do you want to do that? Or whatever it is, or there'd be a new law or a new rule, or there'd be a new health concern, like E. coli became one of our big things with ground fall. We could no longer pick up ground fall fruit because of the E. coli. So how do we implement all this new stuff? And so working with them, yes, I've got an agenda, this is why we're doing it, but how do we implement that into our work?
Well, and were any of these people homeless, or this sounds like a group that would work really well with the homeless?
Yes, there are people that are homeless that are involved in this.
Just off the top of my head, a lot of the homeless around here glean anyway.
Right.
So.
Right.
You're thinking the same thing I am.
Well, and then the community garden, yeah, they're in dumpsters gleaning.
I was thinking dumpster diving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
But,
yeah.
wouldn't it be great to organize
To actually.
Right.
that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, the other thing that's worked really well with a lot of the homeless population is because they're on food stamps or on SNAP, the SNAP incentive stuff has been really good for them in getting them to the market, you know, and they actually look forward to the day they can go to the market and get fresh food. You know, and they may not take the full $6. It may be they only buy $2 or $3 worth because they can't carry it around. But the other thing is to have gardens that are just for the homeless that they take care of and they harvest from.
Right, and that goes back
That's
to
been,
the vacant lots for sure.
yeah, the vacant lots. Or, you know, having fruit trees. I don't know what the situation is with fruit trees here, but the other thing is having fruit trees, or like Seattle has food forests.
Right.
Yeah, and Portland's working on that too. And so we have places where people can just, it's there to harvest, you know. So people eat healthier because it's the food that they can go and get without,
And I was
you
just
know.
thinking in terms of, I mean, it kind of gives people a little bit of control over their life.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can go out and, it's gonna be on their own terms because they're homeless and so they're not gonna do it regularly. But if they can say, I participate in this and I go out, you know, 3 times a month and do this when I'm in the mood, because that's usually what it is.
Mhm.
You know, we're dealing with people who are.
Well, there's a lot of mental illness involved, so yeah.
Yeah, but they're not bad people, they're just living life on their own terms.
Mhm.
And, but I think that would give them a lot of,
That's cool.
what's the word I'm thinking of, John?
Empowerment?
Empowerment.
Yeah.
I mean, and then you start changing people's lives.
Yeah, I wonder if it's something that
So-
the homeless coalition.
Yeah.
So I have a whole set of resources around gleaning groups, which I can provide to John.
Well, and we have a large homeless population in Alexandria because we are an interstate
We're
in
hub,
a
yeah.
small town.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it would work really well here. I do.
And Kendra actually participated in one of our first farming workshops,
Yeah.
farmer workshops we had
Yeah.
a few years ago. So she's really interested in local food.
Well, let's just rub her on in. Get-
Yeah, she's in the.
Man, I
she's
love
in the
Food
garden
Fellows,
group.
Sharon.
Yeah, she's
I
in the
love it.
garden group there.
So another thing that when you're working as a community organizer, you don't want to do this alone. You want to get as many other people there as possible. So surfacing community leadership, you know, if you're going to have breakout in groups and things like that, unless it's something you just really want to control what's going on, don't predetermine who will facilitate and record. Provide opportunities for people to come forward and be leaders and see what happens. A lot of times you're going to find the stars, then let them shine, you know, let the new people. And sometimes that's really hard when you're working with groups or people who have the facilitator types, people who are professional facilitators, they want everything controlled and determined up front, and it's like, no, you're just going to have to let that go, you know. And who are the gatekeepers? So I'm going to bet you that even in your homeless population, there are gatekeepers.
Oh,
That's what I find out. And then just have the courage to let things happen. And sometimes it's chaos, and then amazing things happen.